Thank you for joining the first video chat hosted by CGAP and the World Bank's AgriFin Center of Excellence on Agricultural Finance on collecting and applying data on smallholder agriculture during COVID-19, featuring today's focus on data generators. I'm joined by a wonderful group of panelists with diverse experiences collecting data on smallholder agriculture during COVID-19. I'm Leora Klapper, a lead economist in the Development Research Group at the World Bank. I collect survey and administrative data to measure development problems and think about how to analyze and present the data to inform policy. For example, I collect the Global Findex database, which asks farmers around the world how they're paid for the sale of their agricultural products. In 2017, we added a module to study how farmers and herders manage their risks and losses. So the data shows that agricultural risk is widespread. According to the Global Findex and surveyed economies within sub-Saharan Africa, roughly a third of adults rely on agriculture by growing crops or raising livestock as their main source of their household income. About 2/3 of these adults reported that their household experienced a bad harvest or significant loss of livestock in the past 5 years. But the data also finds that very few farmers get insurance payouts when disaster strikes. Fewer than 1 in 10 adults living in a household that experienced a bad harvest reported that the household received any compensation, such as through an insurance payout or government assistance for their losses. So this is a timely discussion, as COVID has left millions of families more vulnerable to hunger and poverty and threatens to reverse decades of growth in low and middle income countries. COVID and necessary physical distancing also makes it impossible to conduct face-to-face interviews and has upended plans by, I'm sure, all of us on this panel to listen to farmers and other stakeholders. But perhaps COVID is also creating opportunities to experiment with alternative ways to collect data, including mobile and text-based, community-based, etc., and to learn more about financial resilience and what we can collectively do to make farmers, agricultural workers, and agribusiness supply chains stronger in the future. So let me invite our panelists for a first round of introductions. Ruth?
Hi, I'm Ruth Meinzen-Dick, Senior Research Fellow with International Food Policy Research Institute. I'm involved in a wide range of qualitative and quantitative data collection and studies on natural resource management and particularly on gender issues. So I'm really delighted to join this conversation.
Thank you. Venu?
Hi, I'm Venu. I'm a director with 60 Decibels, which is a tech-enabled company that provides customer-centric impact measurement services to the development sector. I lead our work in agriculture and will be sharing some insights from our ongoing work on ongoing COVID-19 research with Kenyan farmers.
Thank you. And Tomoko?
My name is Tomoko Harigaya, and I'm the Director of Research at the Precision Agriculture for Development, or PAD. It's a global nonprofit that enables smallholder farmers to improve their well-being by providing actionable information. We use data and rigorous research to iterate, learn, and scale our services.
So let's start the discussion with Venu. So please tell us more about your ongoing dashboard of farmer surveys in Kenya. What key insights are emerging from your COVID-19 data collection?
Yeah, happy to, Leora. Since June, we've been doing phone surveys with 500 crop and livestock farmers in Kenya every month. And we'll sort of continue to do this until the end of the year and trace farmers through their journey of the small rain season. The objective of this research is to understand the farmers' experience of the pandemic and to understand what support they are asking for. So the support that we are providing is based on those asks and their needs and challenges. After 3 rounds of data collection, what we are seeing is there are 3 clear asks from farmers. The first is cash, the second is affordable inputs, and the third is market access. Now, I don't think any of this is surprising to us. I think these are things that come up in agriculture value chains as support that farmers need all the time. But I'd love to tell you a little bit of the story that we are hearing using the data that we've collected on the dashboard in the first 3 months. The first insight that stood out to me is that 21% of the farmers that we've spoken to in the last 3 months have said that they've lost at least one source of income. And when you look beyond that, you actually see that this reduction is concentrated in stable sources of income. So it's actually coming from either wages or their business, which could or could not be related to agriculture. This just highlights their heightened dependence on farming during this time, and hence their vulnerability to the implications of being dependent on this one main source of livelihood. And at the same time, you can see that farmers are being compelled to make several adjustments in their farming activities to cope with the pandemic. We asked about the adjustments that they had made in the last 2 weeks on their farm to cope with the pandemic, and we've asked the same question 3 times now. And the 3 key activities that 6 in 10 farmers have reported reducing in each round are hired labor, purchase of inputs, and selling produce. And this month, in August, well, so I guess a couple of months back, but we're doing it, presenting these insights as quickly as we can. In August, we asked them what the main drivers are for this reduction in inputs and in labor, or hiring labor. And it wasn't actually health concerns. It wasn't the fact that people couldn't come to their fields, it was costs. So of the people who were reporting a reduction in input purchase and a reduction of hired labor on their field, at least half of them said that this was because costs were high. 42% of the farmers surveyed in August said that input prices were much higher than usual compared to 29% in June. And as we talked, that was the time when farmers were heading into planting and preparing for short rains. And then we also tried to understand what was going on from a market access perspective. And of the 6 farmers who said that they sold less produce to cope with COVID-19, only 2 were actively making the choice to do so they could consume more at home. 4 actually wanted to sell more, but they didn't have the options to. And when we asked them what could be done, they basically said they wanted more creative buyers, transportation, they wanted information about markets. And so the ask is sort of very clear, and it's backed in data, and it's urgent. And they need it now as they prepare for the upcoming season.
No, thank you. That's quite interesting. And certainly to better understand the coping mechanisms, you really want to interview multiple people in the households. And one of the biggest criticisms of phone surveys is that it's harder to reach the more marginalized populations, especially in rural areas. So what efforts have you taken to reach farmers such as women and other marginalized populations?
Yeah, that's a very good point, Leora. And I think that, it is a limitation of phone-based surveys, and we should absolutely admit that, acknowledge that in how we report these results. I think I have 3 reflections on that, a couple of strategies for what you can do when you collect data, and sort of a reflection on how to interpret this data. So the first thing is, ex-ante stratification is always possible, or is most always possible, and should be deliberately done in these cases wherever you can. So in our sample, in each round of 500 farmers that we're speaking with, we are making sure that 50% of them are women, and we're making sure that 2/3 of them have less than 1.2 acres of land, or planted less than 1.2 acres of land in the last 12 months, which is the average land holding in Kenya. Of course, we were able to access a panel of farmers that gave us the opportunity to do this ex-ante stratification. So we're definitely in a place where we were able to do it, but just, don't give up, try, and then consider sort of reweighting your results if you cannot actually achieve that ex-ante stratification. The second thing that I'd say is experiment. In the past, and we're doing a couple of this kind of experimentation even now, but I'll share an example from what I've done in the past. We wanted to speak to women farmers, cocoa farmers in Ghana, as well as male cocoa farmers in Ghana over the phone, but we only had phone numbers of men. And so we asked 100 men if they would let us speak to an adult woman in their household, and 60 we actually were able to get 60 women on the phone. who were at that time in the household. Had we gone back and resurveyed or recalled, we could have potentially got more women on the phone. And 60 is better than nothing. Of course, we'll have to talk about bias, and you're probably still not reaching the more marginalized, the less empowered women in this sample, but it's still bringing the voices that we don't hear to the front. So experiment, don't give up. And I guess the third thing is, when you interpret, so when I look at my dashboard, our dashboard, and interpret the insights that I'm seeing, interpret the asks that farmers are making, cash, inputs, and market access feel like really essential and basic asks. And if farmers with mobile phones are making those asks, you can only imagine that these are possibly needs for even those who don't have phones. Now, of course, I don't know if these are exactly as strongly felt by populations we didn't survey, but I think you can say with reasonable certainty that we don't need to wait for that data to act on this data.
Thank you. So let's continue with Tomoko. So you've taken the approach of listening to different stakeholders along the agribusiness supply chain, so both farmers and agri-dealers. Can you please tell us more about this methodology?
Sure. So we collected data from roughly 1,000 farmers each in 2 states in India and in Kenya. But in Kenya, we had this additional sample of 500 agro-dealers. And one interesting finding is, especially in the early phase, we got somewhat different perspectives or signals from farmers and agro-dealers in terms of the consequences of the COVID on agricultural production. So our first round of survey was in May. That's in the middle of the main agricultural season in Kenya. And farmers were reporting, consistent with what Venu just talked about, reduced labor input. They were also talking about challenges with the food security. But surprisingly, they generally were optimistic about the prospect for harvest. So a small proportion of farmers reported using lower inputs than they did in the previous year. And we actually also saw a relatively low proportion of farmers saying they couldn't buy inputs when they visited agro-dealers in over 2 weeks before the survey. And the majority expected the same or better harvest compared to last season. So that was surprising to us. And especially in contrast, agro-dealers were in May already reporting difficulties with restocking their inputs. They talked about lower footfall. They expected the business to continue to struggle. So the initial impression we got from these 2 data sets were somewhat different. But then in August, we went back and did the second round of survey. And then at that point, August is toward the end of the season. So the majority of farmers were anticipating a lot of challenges with being able to purchase inputs for the next season. And that was mostly because they had a lower income in the past several months. So when you look at all these different data sets, across the different points in time, it is intuitive that, the effects on agricultural production is lagged, right? And it really depends on where in the cropping cycle farmers were when the pandemic started and mobility restrictions were put in place. And based on kind of what we are seeing in the data, unfortunately in Kenya, it looks like maybe the effect would be even larger in the upcoming season, that there might be more negative effects.
Oh, quite interesting. What are some of the limitations of this methodology of trying to pick up the different stakeholders across the agribusiness chain?
Yeah, so one issue is, of course, I think surveying agro-dealers has been much more difficult than surveying farmers because they are more time constraints. I think the response rate was somewhere around probably just below 50%. So we are just kind of getting a selected sample there. And when we are covering a large geographic area, and even though our sample was sufficiently large, kind of being able to match farmers and agro-dealers in the same areas and looking at the trend is still quite difficult. I think we would have needed a much larger sample to be able to do that. So that would have been a quite interesting analysis, but and I think maybe in the future, that's something that we want to consider. And then the second thing I would mention is with, and this is a general point, but with any survey like this, you know, it is difficult to disentangle the changing effects of the pandemic versus the natural trend over the course of a season. So, you know, farmers' constraints change over the course of the season, their cash availability, needs for inputs and labor. So, you know, we try to ask a lot of production questions in comparisons to last year, but even then, I think that's definitely a caveat.
Interesting. Thank you. Ruth, so you have the unique experience conducting mobile phone surveys across multiple sub-Saharan African countries and India after COVID-19. I've only surveyed farmers in person. Can you tell us how this shift in methodology influences how you think people are answering your questions and how it affects your interpretation of the findings?
Yes, and I'll preface that by saying that a lot of our in-person surveys are specifically dealing with gender issues. And so we do a lot of effort to make sure that the women and men are interviewed separately and that the women are in private. And if there's a child around, you note that, right? And you record that so that if the mother-in-law is in the room, you can control for that. Now you go to phone surveys and it's harder to get the woman alone, but also you don't know. So the big striking thing, we started this working in India with Self-Employed Women's Association. And fortunately, they warned us that their members, when they called them to say, expect this call, they had to have their phones on speaker setting. And it was like, oh, we thought that at least our question would be in private, even if somebody might overhear the answer, because if you're locked down in one house, you know, it's hard to get the privacy. And that changes things. And so we fortunately added a question because what we first heard was that women, either their husbands or their in-laws, would not allow them to take the phone not on speaker setting. So that means if we ask, is your phone on speaker, that could already get them in trouble, create suspicion. So then we sort of came up with a question of, is your phone on speaker? You know, I'm having a little hard time hearing, I need to adjust something, just so that we could record it. And can I please make the plea that everybody in the world who is asking phone surveys, ask if your phone is on speaker, because we found it actually affects the answers. So it was really striking. With the SEWA members, 65% of the respondents had their phone on speaker. And that meant that we were asking about questions of gendered impact on loss of livelihoods, food and water insecurity, and control over income. And what we can show is that the women who reported their phone was on speaker were more likely to report that their spouse was the sole decision maker for their own income, and less likely to report that they were the sole decision maker over their own income, and similar impacts on who makes decisions about your spouse's income. So that was like, So fortunately that was our first survey. We put that question in. What we're finding is that we don't know how much it's disempowerment or just convenience, but because in Nepal, 42% of men and 47% of women have it on speaker. Nigeria, it's 41% of men, Nigeria and Ghana, it's over 40% of men and women. So you really need to to take this into account when you're designing your survey as well as when you're analyzing the results.
That's fascinating and really important for all of our vendors. I've often been concerned, for example, when we ask women about savings, how they respond when other family members are in the room, especially savings they don't want other family members to know about. And I'm really curious, why do you think respondents, both men and women, are going on speakerphone?
So our first hypothesis was that it was the suspicion of women taking a call in private. And that may still be a factor. We're trying to analyze, see if we can predict that, is it, if they're in a multi-generational household where they have in-laws there and things like that. But it may also be convenience. A lot of these people don't have a headset, and so if their hands are busy, you put it on speaker. Or it might be, this is awkward, and it might also be that they've, some people say, well, maybe it's easier to hear if they've got it on speaker. It could be a whole range of things. This is where we'd love to do more qualitative work on what are the reasons for this. We need to get into this more.
Oh, very interesting. Thank you. So let's move the discussion now around how all your amazing insights can be used to inform policy. Tomoko, let's start. If you could tell us a little bit, how are you disseminating insights from your work?
Yeah, so our approach has been really producing, different types of outputs, both broad insights and tailored insights for different audiences using really all channels available at this point. So, I think, we do want to kind of analyze data in different ways and generate different levels of, insights at different levels of granularity. And it's not possible for one data generator to kind of meet the needs of every stakeholder, but I think there are things that we can do to facilitate that process to some extent. So first, making documentation and data available. So we actively shared these materials with other groups that wanted to collect data and posted all the materials. And now I think one of the raw data set also is available on our website, so anyone can download and do more analysis. And we do this because we want to prevent or minimize the reinventing of the wheel. And then we also want the data to be used for as many purposes as possible. And crowdsourcing can be effective there.
Thank you.
And then second,
I'm sorry, please continue.
let me just say kind of one more thing about, just generally sharing insights and analysis. So we've also done like a lot of putting together different types of policy brief summary reports, blogs, for different audiences. And, there are no in-person meetings, but still like meetings are happening on Zoom and right. So some of our teams have, participated in these policy meetings, and I think there are still kind of interesting discussions and conversations going on with stakeholders and ministries and so forth.
Thank you. Venu, your really important findings, especially, for example, around the costs of inputs. Who do you hope to reach with your research, and how are you reaching them during these more challenging times?
Yeah, our hope is to bring these actionable insights to anyone who's making decisions about what their strategy should be to support farmers during this time. It could be nonprofits, it could be social enterprises, it could be foundations, investors, government, policy actors, anyone really. And it's truly coming from the place of believing that farmers are at the center of our global food systems, and their voices aren't heard as often in conversations about our global food systems and how we can help them recover from COVID-19 and help them become more resilient in the future. We've of course the first thing that we've done to disseminate this information is create an online dashboard that is, we've tried our best to make it interactive. It's got many filters. You can see what the results are for women versus men, for poorer farmers versus better off farmers, crop farmers, livestock farmers, land size, by month of collection, region. So we've really provided any user of this data an opportunity to slice the data in whatever way they'd like live on our dashboard. And we hope that that is helpful, especially in understanding how to target support to sub-segments of the farmer base. And then the second thing that and this is updated every month, as I may or may not have shared earlier. So it's updated every month in the middle of the month with 500 new data points. We have funding to do this till the end of the year. So you'll get to see what is most important to farmers in that month if you'd like to use this data in near real time. In addition to this, we're reaching out to a core group of just friends, interested supporters every month when we do an update to a dashboard. We're using social media. We're also on IPA's Recover Hub. I think the PAD dashboard is as well. And we're trying to convene a group of development actors every 2 months or so to get their reflections on how they are using this information. We try to make it a combination of us and a couple of practitioners in this space. So that's been instructive. And the last thing is, we really wanted to get the word out where it mattered. So we've put out a press release, which has actually got traction from some of the local newspapers in Kenya. And I think that's hopefully going to lead to more farmer voices being heard as a part of this conversation. So that's also kind of happening on the side. That's just about the code work. I'll pause there, and of course we're doing a bunch of other work that I can speak to, which it involves speaking to customers of social enterprises in other sectors as well.
No, thank you. And I fully agree that the regional press are really important. I think we sometimes err on trying to hit the top tier, US, UK media, but it can be our results can be most impactful when publicized by local press. And just like curiosity, have you reached out to any of the input producers to better understand why costs have increased so dramatically?
So that's a great question. I mean, there are a few social enterprises in our network that we have just shared these insights with. So hopefully we'll have some feedback on what's going on over the next few days. But in general, I think the sense is that the supply is limited, and that's why costs are higher. I don't have a good answer, to be honest, but would love to see if anyone else does on this panel.
So Ruth, going back to, I think what's quite exciting about your data collection effort is that you're bringing together multi-country efforts to build a more comprehensive understanding of the challenges facing farmers during COVID-19. What sort of efforts have you done to sort of leverage the multi-country dimension of your data?
Well, we're still in the process of getting each of the countries, we have multiple waves in each country, so we're still in the process of getting each one of them. So to date, we haven't had one big outreach comparatively, but we've been doing within each of the countries, what are the emerging, what's the sort of even just the basic descriptive analysis. And part of that is also that donors really wanted to know what's going on in different places. But as I mentioned, the first of the studies was with SEWA. They wanted to know what was happening to their own members of different types of members. And I mean, for all of these, we've used the webinars and blogs and social media. We were fortunate enough that we had some evidence early enough to when you could do a webinar and people were not totally saturated. So that got lots of attention, I think, and discussion and follow-up questions coming in. So people were still engaged at that point. We're trying something a little different with the SEWA work. In addition to the phone surveys, we've also had case studies of individual women. And we were able to get photos of them as well. And what I like about this qualitative approach is that the phone surveys are really short. You can only ask, maybe 20 questions, and you have to ask it consistently. You don't get the whole person. You're getting just a really narrow slice. Whereas the phone surveys, the women open up about much more of their life. And you see that, for example, they have really complex livelihood strategies. They may be pursuing 3 different things, and one of them gets hit, and a migrant is returning home, and this and that. And so what we're working with our communications division to come up with something a little bit more innovative also, not quite a photo essay, but where you can then, we'll use the survey results, but then to find out more about what this is like, click on this woman, you get a little bit about her, and then you can open up her whole story. And you get in repercussions that we couldn't ask about. Like one woman is talking about experiencing gender-based violence. We couldn't ask about that in the phone survey because there's lots of complexities, especially if it's on on speakerphone. But you can get at some of that richer discussion. And what we're hoping is that it'll make people care in a way that sometimes numbers, is this heresy to say that numbers sometimes just make people's eyes glaze over, but a story can make them care and see how the picture fits together?
No, absolutely. I'm a big fan of, for example, financial diaries, starting with diaries of the financial lives of the poor. MFO, for example, is doing weekly surveys of female garment workers in Bangladesh, which is just fascinating and allows you to, again, get into the nuance and the weeds and explain some of the mysteries in the aggregate data, which we're, also studying and collecting. It's quite interesting. So we're delighted that we received a number of questions on social media touching on a number of topics, which I sort of organized. So let me start with the first question. What should be our priority data sets? So what data do we think are most important in identifying pathways for recovery and resilience among smallholders? What new forms of both qualitative and quantitative data would you flag for researchers? So I see, Venu, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I can respond, and then if we have time, it'll be good to hear the panelists as well. So first thing, I always say this, I've said this a couple of times already, but I think it's worth repeating. I think the most important thing is to ask farmers what their challenges are and what they need in this moment. And I understand that's self-reported. I understand that there's lots of constraints there. And quite often when you ask that question, you get asked for cash. But that might actually be what is needed right now. So let's not discount for that. Let's still ask the question and see what comes up. And that's the most important, to determine how farmers should be supported in their recovery and how to make our food systems resilient. Then the next set of data that I think would be interesting to collect is how are disruptions in the supply chain manifesting in adjustments that farmers are having to make on their farm or in their livestock rearing. And so what I mean by that is, are they, again, having to hire less labor? Are they paying higher prices? So the kinds of metrics that Tomoko, the PAD dashboard has, and some of them are also on our dashboard, those kinds of insights about the disruption of the supply chain. I think the third thing is, COVID-19 is a shock in a way that none of us wanted or anticipated. Farmers live through similar shocks as a part of their life. And so in some sense, this is an unfortunate natural experiment that allows us to collect information about how a shock that's hit the world is, how that experience evolves over time for a farmer. So if you have the opportunity to collect data in a longitudinal way, and even if it's not longitudinal with the same people, but you can do cross-sectional data collection at regular intervals, it will be really helpful to understand how people's consumption patterns change over time and at what point they're likely to stabilize. We do not have longitudinal data collection built into our panel, so we weren't able to do this, but we've partnered with IPA to develop an excellent tool to measure variability in poverty called the consumption PPI. And I would recommend using and investing in tools like that during this time. Yeah, so I'll stop there. I guess, one point to add, and that's most of what I just described is quantitative data, but I think it's really important to ask the why after you ask the what. So once you know what is not happening, so hired labor is not being hired that often, why is that? And get that qualitative insight and make sure that follow-up question is in your survey so you can do something about the root cause instead of just diagnosing the trend.
Thank you. I always say that's why we do the harder work of collecting demand side data, from the users of products to complement the supply side administrative data, because we can ask the people, what seems illogical to us sitting in Washington makes a lot of sense to poor adults around the world. And so, especially now during the crisis, understanding how people are managing their own coping mechanisms is really important. So the second set of questions, there were a number of questions around, ensuring that we're reaching women. So Venu, you gave example of asking men to pass on their phones, but how we're addressing the challenges of reaching women remotely, especially given what we know from both GSMA and Gallup data on women's mobile phone ownership. For example, I pulled some numbers, and Gallup found that in 2019 in India, men were 15 percentage points more likely than women to have a phone. In Ethiopia, the mobile phone gap is 20 percentage points. In Pakistan, over 80% of men report having a mobile phone, compared to about 20% of women. So as we're moving to phone-based surveys, what other tricks do you have, magic to reach the voices of women in these countries?
So I can come in on this because this is something I've been worrying about a lot, that a lot of the conventional mechanisms are going to have bias samples, not only women, but poorer households and poorer women in particular, and older, because it tends to be younger people who will have the phones as well. So one strategy that we're using is we're using earlier surveys that we have wherever possible, and if there are phone numbers in those, then we use that, and we then know the name of the woman, and even if it's not her phone, we can ask for her by name. And because we've had, if the earlier survey established some rapport, that increases the likelihood that that she will be interviewed. I just want to add one more complication we found out in India is that even if a woman had a phone, that when finances get tight, they may be sacrificing the top-ups or the renewal of her phone. So we found a lot of the phone numbers that we had were no longer working if they were women's phones, or they were more likely to be not working if they were women's phones. And that relates to another point about resilience. Finding out, Venu's, your point about the long-term effects and doing repeated surveys, what we're looking at is the coping strategies. In past crises, we found that very often women's assets are the ones that are sacrificed in order to maintain consumption, which may make sense in the short term, but then what do you do to build back up those assets over the longer term? And what are the consequences, even in the short term, of that sacrifice of her assets? And we need to know how that's playing out here as well.
Absolutely. No, thank you. So another question, series of questions was around capacity building. So how do we build public and private institutional capacity to manage and interpret the smallholder farmer data sets that we're collecting, and the digitization efforts to make rapid evidence-based decisions to increase productivity, and or to address various shocks. And I guess embedded in that question is, is there a value proposition to monetize the data, and or should governments play an enabling, subsidizing role? Tomoko, do you want to take on the harder question?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we can probably spend a whole hour on this topic. But there's some brief thoughts, and many of that kind of based on our experience at PAD. I think in terms of institutional capacity building and kind of promoting evidence-based decisions, can think of kind of three things. One is creating feedback loop between data generators and implementers or policymakers, and sometimes the data generator and implementer can be the same entity, like the case for PAD. But this is not something that we can kind of create when a shock hits. So this is a space that definitely there's a room for the public sector to invest and develop these different digital infrastructures. And also, I also think that there's a lot of possibility in creating two-way communications. So all these challenges with following up with respondents, now I feel that there are a lot of services that are digitized, like mobile money, for example. If we are able to kind of use the data that's kind of indicative of behaviors of the target populations, or creating I think there are a lot of entities or digital ag information services that also collect data or set up a hotline service so farmers can just call in and record a question. And in one location we actually summarized some of these questions that were coming in through a hotline service and just to pass on that information to stakeholders, and they actually found those fairly local relevant data to be very, very useful, and they can decide which information is most relevant and react to. So I think that's one other thing that there's a huge area that I think untapped data that's out there. And then in terms of the monetization, I think there's a huge value in creating incentives for entities that have the data to share for public benefits. But I don't think it necessarily needs to be financial incentives. So, there are many value chain players in agriculture, for example, that actually have aligned incentives, right? For example, contract farming companies, they actually benefit from farmers increasing productivity. So in maybe those are kind of lower hanging fruits. Because I think there is a range of many difficult questions around, privacy, consent issues, before being able to monetize the data.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to jump in on this question? Well, I'm going to abuse my role as host and this awesome panel of women to ask a question that I'm grappling with, which is building trust by phone with your respondents. Right, so especially in countries that have phone-based financial fraud, we're finding it really hard to ask questions around your personal finances. As soon as you start asking about your bank account or your money, they either hang up, get suspicious, or answer incorrectly, which we're finding as well. Have any of you found using any techniques to try to build this trust, this remote trust with your respondents to get truthful, honest information?
So I can say,
please.
I can speak to some. So I think a few things are important here. I don't think you can collect every single kind of information on the phone, and that is not what I want to say with this message. I think you have to be careful about what you ask and what you collect. Now, with that caveat, what has helped us is actually focusing on the more conversational questions up front, investing in the introduction, investing in building rapport, and coming to then the household questions sort of towards the end of the survey, the financial questions at the end of the survey. And then also giving people an out. So saying and acknowledging that these questions might be uncomfortable. And if you don't feel comfortable answering them, that's okay. And we just have to deal with the fact that our data set will not be complete, but it's important that the respondents' experience is pleasant and one of trust, right? So that just acknowledging that and giving them an out helps. And then when it comes to the specifics of what kinds of questions are being asked, I think if you can reduce the brain pain that the other person is experiencing from answering those questions and help them understand why those questions are important, you are quite likely to succeed. So don't ask them how much they saved over the last 12 months. Like, I don't know. And so, like, make sure that your recall in this instance is a reasonable amount of time, right? Explain to them that the reason that we're trying to understand this is so we can do X, Y, and Z with the research, right? So I think just that explanation goes a long way. But at the same time, we experienced that difficulty as well, Leora. I don't think we've been able to overcome it. I think we've accepted that some of the financial indicators in our data will not be complete, and we might have to increase the sample size or sort of adjust for various things exposed.
Thanks for those excellent suggestions. Anybody else want to jump in on the question? Ruth.
Just briefly, female enumerators tend to get higher response rates, even from men, than, even in the US, that tends to be the case. Especially young female enumerators that have this really engaging voice.
So one thing we found is really like the local partnership, importance of local partnerships. And that makes a big difference in kind of willingness to just to take a survey over the phone. And yeah, so you know, whether it's a kind of a, I mean, I think working with partners could introduce different types of biases, but that's you know, that's always, I think, something that is worth considering, I think.
Yeah, and certainly an introduction from an association, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but really it's been a pleasure chatting with all of you, and my sincere thanks for your really insightful and this useful discussion. For those of you listening at home, please make sure to check out the next AgriFin CGAP discussion on collecting and applying data on smallholder agriculture during COVID-19, next focusing on data consumers with another great set of panelists. So thank you to all.